Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Gallery of Modern Art and to the June edition of Perspectives Asia. It's my great pleasure to welcome you. My name is Simon Elliott. I'm the Deputy Director, newly started at the Queensland Art Gallery, and it's wonderful to have you here this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and indeed extend that welcome to any Indigenous people that we have here this evening. In the spirit of reconciliation, and of course because we're standing in an art gallery, I'd also like to comment that I'd like to acknowledge the great artistic talent of Indigenous Australians and what they've done for this country's art and the world. So there's also some, everyone is welcome, but I'd like to acknowledge in particular Professor Ian O'Connor, our Vice-Chancellor of Griffith University and Chair of the Queensland Art Gallery Trustees, and Mrs Anna Reynolds. And also Professor Ian Hall, Acting Director of Griffith Asia Institute, and of course our two special guests, Madeleine O'Dea and Professor Sue Trevaskes. Tonight, as part of the ongoing enduring Perspective Asia partnership between QAGOMA, Australian Centre for Asia-Pacific Art, and Griffith University's Griffith Art Institute, we have a fascinating discussion this evening. You cannot talk about contemporary art in Asia without acknowledging the role artists play in China in the late 20th and early 21st century. Importantly, it speaks to the very heart of the Queensland Art Gallery's vision to be a leading institution for contemporary art of Australia, Asia and Pacific. As we know, some very influential artists in China have been critically engaged in the dialogues around social and political developments in that country since the late 1970s. And this gallery has been engaged with Chinese art and artists since the first Asia-Pacific Triennial back in 1993. And many of those artists have been quite strategically included in our exhibitions and indeed our collection. To our speakers, our special guest tonight, Madeleine O'Dea, is a writer and journalist who's been covering the political, economic and cultural life of China for the past 3 decades. She was the Australian Financial Review's correspondent in Beijing in the late 1980s and covered China for the ABC TV through the 1990s. She went on to create and edit Art Info China and the Report from Asia for Art and Auction and Modern Painters magazine, and numerous other art and general news publications. Her book, The Intimate History of Post-Cultural Revolution China, The Phoenix Years, published in Australia last year and is available tonight, is also upcoming American edition in the pipeline, is told primarily through the eyes of China's emerging avant-garde artists. It has been called Essential and Delightful by Thomas Keneally, and beautifully crafted and immensely readable in the pages of The Australian. Tonight, she's in conversation with Sue Trevaskes, Professor of China Studies at the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Sciences and the Griffith Criminology Institute at Griffith University. Sue is also Adjunct Director of the Australian Centre on China in the World at the Australian National University and has made contributions to the field of contemporary Chinese criminal justice studies and to conversations around contemporary Chinese art and culture here in Brisbane. It is my great pleasure to welcome Sue and Madeleine.
Thank you. My job tonight's fairly simple. I'm the interviewer. She's the interviewee. Now, let's start by quoting Tom Keneally, who said, "Let no one speak of China who has not read The Phoenix Years." Wow, what an endorsement. Tell us how this book came about.
Well, as was just mentioned, I've been in and out of China for the past 30 years and over that time lived there for more than a decade. And the question that I was always asked by friends in Australia when I'd go home for visits was, why do you live there? You know, what are you doing in that country? You know, what's so good about it? And I realised over the years that people were aware that China, of course, was a major story. Something incredible was going on there. China was obviously very important for Australia economically, but they couldn't understand why someone wanted to actually live there, why they were so engaged with the place. And I realised there was a whole story about China that was really unknown, which was a story that had kept me going back to China year after year after year, which was a story of not the kind of top-down development in China, the China that's been driven by both political leadership, but the China that's been created from below by ordinary Chinese people. And it's that story that I really wanted to tell. And when I thought about how do you tell that story of how a country's been so transformed in more than 30 years of history, how do you tell that story? I realised that it was in plain sight, that the thing I needed to do was look at the contemporary Chinese artists and the way they had tried to tell the story of their country and how intimately they've been involved in the development of Chinese culture. And so that was kind of the background of the story. I wanted to answer the question, why do I spend so much time in China? Well, because it's such an extraordinarily fascinating place with a kind of exciting but also quite tragic history, I think, in the last 30, 40 years.
And these artists hold up a mirror to that age, that time, 1980s, when both of us were living in China. We were like ships in the night. Madeleine had left China the month I arrived in 1989 to work in the embassy in the cultural section, and I got to know a lot of artists and writers at that time. And the artists in this book, they hold up a mirror to the excitement of the times. And you know, we sound like old ladies talking about our heyday, but really the 1980s were unbelievably fantastic in China. In terms of the art scene, artists, writers, rock stars were all together in unity and in spirit, thinking about how they could forge a future. But they were also locked to the past, and it was getting to grips with the Cultural Revolution as much as it was getting to grips with the future of China, that the 1980s, that's the reason why the 1980s was just so pivotal in China's history. I'm just wondering if you could just...
That slide up.
What an amazing slide. Now, tell us about this slide, this picture. What's going on here, and when is this?
This is like a really incredibly stunning photograph, actually. What it's capturing here, it's late 1979. It's October 1979. And what this is the first ever demonstration in China for freedom of speech. And it's coming, and you'll see, people who can read Chinese, up the top here, we've got the banner which says we're marching in support of the Constitution. And at that point, the Chinese Constitution had just been revised in 1978, and it was full of, wonderful principles which people believe would be embodied in the new China. This group of people here are all artists. And what's happened is that the month previously, in September, they have created the first Chinese contemporary art exhibition also. And they've created it not in a gallery space or official venue, because that would have been impossible in 1979. They've created a kind of guerrilla art exhibition where they've actually exhibited their work outside the National Art Museum of Beijing. And it's been a very successful thing, and lots of people come to see it, but within a couple of days the police have come and shut it down, because this is not an officially recognised event, and they've been told they can't have it. Anyway, so instead of giving up, they decide to march and say, well, look, the Constitution says we have a right to freedom of expression, a right to assemble on the street, a right to demonstrate our feelings in a sense. So they create this demonstration, which is an extraordinary event. Nothing like this ever before in the People's Republic of China. And they march in a group, and from left to right we have some of the great artists of China still today. Wang Keqing, over here on the left, holding one end of the banner. Ma Deshang, who had polio as a child and so was forever on crutches, still alive, living now in Paris and working. And Huang Rui, who's the kind of a key figure in my book. He's the kind of father of Chinese contemporary art and continues to be a really important figure. They're marching here for the freedom to exhibit their work. The thing about them, and this Sue was saying just then, is that one thing you have to remember about the 80s, when you think about the 80s and this period in China, is that what these people are reacting to is their experience in the Cultural Revolution. So all of these artists who are now in their 20s in this photograph have all in their teens been sent to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. And they've all had the opportunity to see that all their kind of idealistic dreams about China are actually not true. Before they go to the countryside, they really believe in China, the revolution. They believe that out there in the countryside, when they go there, they'll find apple-cheeked peasants happily, tilling the fields in the cause of Chinese communism. When they get there, they find, in fact, incredible poverty and cynicism and despair. They come back to their hometowns, in Beijing in this case, and other parts of the country, 17 million of people like this who've gone to the countryside, and they come back with this desire to change things. They've seen how bad things are in the country, and they want things to change. And they see in the start of the open door policy, which starts in late 1978, an opportunity. They looked at Deng Xiaoping and they think, he's talking about opening China to the West, he's talking about opening the economy. This is a chance for us too to stand up for what we believe in. And what they believe in is art and the desire to express themselves and to not be told anymore what to think. So this slide really embodies all those thoughts.
Wonderful, yeah. Now, you have a passage early on in the book about the 9 artists, and what I love about the book is that these artists' lives are woven throughout the book, but it's really a history book for me. I was just wondering, if you don't mind, would you mind reading that passage? I'll find the page. Have you got it's page 12, I think. If you could just read that passage of the artists so that people can get a sense of who these artists are.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind.
No, not at all. So basically, I list the sort of the main characters in the book. When I think about how to relate the history of this period, I think of these artists and the picture of China they have painted, not just in their work, but in their lives as well. I think of the best-selling artist whose teenage years were overshadowed by the Cultural Revolution and his mother's mental illness, who enrolled in art school at the dawn of the Chinese avant-garde and went on to create soulful images after 1989 that remain among the most iconic works of Chinese contemporary art today. I think of another whose older sister died of starvation during the Great Leap Forward, and who then went on to join the army to escape his poverty, who survived a war thanks to his flair for painting propaganda for the troops, who was then talent spotted to study art in the capital and achieved success, only to be exiled for refusing to forget what he had seen in Beijing in June of 1989. I think of another who rallied in Tiananmen Square with fellow students that spring, overwhelmed with excitement and hope, who left the country in despair after June the 4th, having performed one last desperate self-destructive act, and yet, despite it all, returned to live and work in Beijing, seeking in all his works to honour the spirit of the companions of his youth. I think of another whose father created sculptures in tribute to Chairman Mao, but who herself documents the dreams of factory workers and creates online fantasy worlds for everyone to live in, where Tiananmen Square is turned into a swimming pool and Confucius is swept away in a flood. I think of another who, as a boy, played in the wasteland of decommissioned factories in China's frozen north, who dreamt of building rockets and making art while his parents and all the adults he knew got laid off. And yet he grew up to find a success his family could barely understand, while his hometown rose again to claim a place at the centre of foreign trade. I think of another born in a desert oasis on what was once the Silk Road, whose works shimmer like mirages, saturated with the colours and images of a way of life that resists the development that threatens to crush it. I think of another born in Lhasa, who studied in Beijing and embraced it as a second home, and yet eventually was driven to take the road to Dharamsala, who found success in faraway London and New York, but dreams that one day soon he will return home to Tibet. And another whose feet are tattooed with leopard spots, who dreams of being a punk rocker, but who nonetheless makes art that aches with a frustrated idealism the frustrated idealism of her generation, and a nostalgia for a China that is slipping away. And lastly, I think of a designer, Huang Rui, who decided to create a blue cover for a poetry magazine in 1978. We'll explain why blue is important later. And went on to form a group of artists called the Stars, who later turned an abandoned military factory into a safe zone for art, who's seen his work criticised and banned, who's been evicted from his studio as a troublemaker, only to create a new haven for himself less than a kilometre away, and who, through it all, persists with his work as if the most extravagant ideals of his youth are still within his grasp.
Brilliant. So you begin in chapter 2 with Huang Rui, and who together with the poets Beidao and Mang Ke started this groundbreaking magazine called Today, 今天. And let me take a turn to read a few paragraphs. It sets the tone in the lead up to the introduction of this magazine called 今天. So we're talking about the poets and the artists, the three of them. When these three had sat down to choose what they would publish in the very first issue of their magazine, they knew they had no right to expect it would last beyond its first printing. It was possible that they would be arrested before they even printed a second issue, and so for that first and possibly the last edition, they each chose a kind of personal manifesto. Huang Rui, in the middle, was a manifesto in colour. He knew he was an artist, not a poet, and his statement was the cover of Today, an image of two young people breasting the tape in a race for a new world, an image rendered in the colour of the boundless sky. For Mang Ke, his manifesto would come in the form of a poem. Beidao's poem, called The Answer, was destined to become one of the most influential in contemporary Chinese history. 10 years after it first appeared in Today, its lines would be emblazoned on students' banners as they rallied in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Beidao had written it soon after the events of the Qingming protests in 1976. His most famous stanza of The Answer reads, let me tell you, world, I do not believe, 我不相信, in Chinese. If 1,000 challenges lie beneath your feet, count me as number 1001. And that was the anthem of the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, it's really profound that I do not believe. Because, this is a generation and a culture that's been told to believe in certain things, to believe in Mao Zedong thought, to believe in an ideal of China. And to state that kind of statement, I do not believe, is so revolutionary. I would choose to believe what I would choose to believe. I do not believe. It's a very strong statement. And it's not surprising to me that it's continued to be such an important poem in China, that it appeared in '89, but people refer to that. It's one of the great masterpieces, really, of Chinese literature.
Yeah, and tell us about the stars. You mentioned the stars.
Yeah, so what happens is that, so Huang Rui is involved with his friends, poets Mang Ke and Beidao, in creating 今天, this wonderful magazine, which in itself is history-making. It's the first unofficial, non-authorised literary publication of the People's Republic of China. So they create this magazine together. But he himself he knows he's no poet. He writes poetry, but he thinks it's pretty terrible. What he does know is he really wants to be an artist. But again, he's never been trained. It's all self-taught. But he's determined to do this. And so he begins to paint, and he seeks instruction from old painters around Beijing and so on to help him with that. And he seeks out other young people like himself who are interested in creating art. And he finds this group of comrades, all of whom have been sent to the countryside in their teens, so have not finished their their studies at school. They've all failed to get into the art school. They've tried to get into official art school in Beijing after it's reopened in 1977. They've failed to get in, but they're not thwarted by that. They decide they have things they want to express. They're creating work, and so they create a group called the Stars. And I must say, when I first heard that there was this first group of contemporary artists in China were called the Stars, I thought, it's a pretty kind of arrogant name to choose for your art movement. But then when I spoke to Huang Rui, I realised that, of course, there's a joke in it, and it's all to do with Mao Zedong, who, of course, was the sun. Mao was always referred to as the sun in the sky, and there was much talk about him, being this sun in the sky. And Huang Rui said to me, the point about the stars is you can't see them. When the sun is up, you can't see them. It's only when the sun is gone that you can see the stars. And so that was kind of the joke behind the name. Anyway, they decided they wanted to have an art exhibition. And as I mentioned previously, there was no chance of them getting an official place to do their art because they're not from the art school, they're not in the Artists Association, they have no official status. And so they decide very cheekily, they know that in October of 1979 there's going to be a big exhibition of Chinese art in the National Art Museum in the centre of Beijing. And this will be very official kind of art. And they think, well, a lot of people will be coming to see that. So perhaps what we will do is we will install our exhibition just outside the museum. And so they scout it out and they find there's just a nice sort of piece of little park next door, there's some railings, they think this is perfect. And they put some flyers out to their friends to tell them that they're going to do this thing kind of the day before. And then on this particular day, they just roll up with their pedal carts and just install this whole wonderful exhibition of more than 100 works outside the museum. And this is in a Beijing where, I don't know if people have been to Beijing, but today it's a vast city. But there was a time in the late 70s where it was really contained within what's now called the Second Ring Road, so what would have been the old walls of Beijing. So it's kind of a small city. It doesn't take long for people to hear about this amazing event that's happening. There's this art exhibition, and so hundreds and hundreds of people come to see it. And with this exhibition, that's the kind of, they fire the starter's gun to Chinese contemporary art, the first exhibition of Chinese contemporary art, and really from then on it just, that's the start of the history.
Right, thanks, yeah. Look, I'll read now your depiction of Goergen. Goergen was a fellow who came from Guizhou province, and he had a great awakening when he came to Beijing in the early 80s. And I'll read you a portion of your description on Goergen and what happened when he arrived in Beijing, starry-eyed. The whole of Western modernism was coming at China in a rush. Revolutions in thought, long assimilated into the Western canon, broke over them in waves. The whole of 20th century art was telescoped too. Cubism, Expressionism, Warhol and Dali were all jumbled into whatever patterns Goergen and thousands like him felt like making. Just like the mixtapes of Western music, Western culture arrived in China in a glorious mashup that gave it a new vitality. Great description. So tell us about Goergen.
Oh, Goergen is an amazing figure, and like his life story, it's like Tom Jones, like it's one extraordinary event after another. He's born in a very poor province of China, Guizhou, and he comes from what the Chinese used to call a bad class background, which is that his grandfather was a landlord. And so as a result of that, his family had kind of, come down the world a bit under Chinese Communist People's Republic of China. But at any rate, he, in the Cultural Revolution, he just ran wild like many kids did at that age. He's a bit younger than this generation, so he didn't get sent away to the countryside. He just got to basically not go to school for year after year, which he found quite enjoyable. Eventually, his ambition from when he was very young was to be an artist, but he didn't really quite know how that would ever come to be. His second ambition was to join the army. He thought that joining the army would be the most glamorous thing in the world. He kept trying to apply to join the army from when he was fairly young, late teens, and every time he seemed to pass all the exams, but somehow he'd never get in. It was only years later he found out it was his bad class background that was held against him. No way would a landlord's son be able to join the army. But then, as luck may have it, in 1979, China decided, quite actually in kind of complete miscalculation, to invade Vietnam. They decided that Vietnam was getting too uppity and was getting too close to the Soviet Union. And Vietnam had just invaded Cambodia to depose Pol Pot. China thought, oh, this was all, this was not what they expected from their little brother communist country. And so they decided they would just have a kind of limited incursion into Vietnam, teach them a lesson, get them to withdraw their troops from Cambodia with a bit of a shock from the PLA, and then retreat. But what actually happened was they invaded, and the Vietnamese just, had them for lunch, really. It was just awful. And so they ended up, although they kind of withdrew, they ended up having to fight a kind of a border war with Vietnam for almost 10 years. And so as a result of that, they were looking for troops. And so Goergen was finally admitted into the army. So he went to the army, and at that point in his life, he got to, for the first time, really learn to speak Mandarin Chinese, to meet people from all around China, and also to really develop his artistic talent, which was recognised pretty quickly by his superiors in the army, and he became part of the propaganda troop. So anyway, as a result of all this, when he got out of the army, he'd actually built up quite a body of work, which was quite beautiful, which allowed him to apply to go to university in Beijing at a time when there was a particular university in Beijing focused on bringing people from ethnic minority places to Beijing. He got kind of talent spotted and brought to Beijing, which meant that he arrived in time to be in Beijing in the middle 80s, which is probably, I don't think it's just because Sue and I spent a lot of time in China in the 80s, really is the great decade of Chinese development in post-Cultural Revolution. It's the decade where people really started to believe that China, there were immense opportunities for China, things were really opening up, and so he was there in that time.
And in fact, you describe, let's go to the late 80s, you describe 1989 as the hinge year of contemporary Chinese history. Just wondering how the massacre in Tiananmen changed the lives of the artists, well, people in general, but the artists in particular.
Yeah, I just put this image up because it's a good example of one particular artist and the change it made in his own life. This is a very famous image by an artist, Sheng Qi. This is a photograph of his hand, and there is no Photoshop involved here. You see that there's the little finger is missing. It's missing because he actually severed the finger himself in the months after the massacre in Tiananmen Square, as a kind of just in a moment of despair, really, but also in a moment of trying to kind of separate himself from the past and from the things he'd seen. Things that happened in Beijing in 1989. I mean, 1989 is like the pivotal year in Chinese contemporary history, and it's a very remarkable thing that when you go to China and you talk to people, that they talk very naturally about before 89 and after 89. It's often referred to in the way that I imagine there must have been a time for people of a certain generation where they would talk about before the First World War and after the First World War, that there's a moment where society changes. And in China, it's very much the same thing with June 89. Before that moment, there was a sense that China was on a trajectory that would lead to a more and more open China, to a more and more ideal China in a way, a China where all citizens would participate, that it would be, it would just get better and better and better. That was the kind of the feeling that was there. And that was to some extent encouraged by what was happening at the top politically, not just Deng Xiaoping, but other leaders. There was a sense of progress. Another way of thinking about the 80s is to compare it to the 60s in the West, because of most of us are too young to really remember that too, but you know how people talk about the 60s in the West and what an extraordinary decade it was, a pivotal decade. 80s is like that. So up until 89, there was a sense that although there might be occasional reversals, that things were just going to keep on opening up. The sunlit uplands were ahead. And then in 89, there was this moment of great disillusionment, that in fact it was not going to be that easy. And that in fact China would go on a slightly different path. And after 89, a new kind of realisation would dawn, which would be China would certainly get certainly much more rich and more powerful and much more open in many, many ways. You saw the slide before of all those guys demonstrating. They're all in those Mao suits. Well, you don't see that today. People can dress as they like. Things are going to change. But they're going to change within a kind of acceptance that political reform is really off the agenda. And so that means that in the post-89 period, people are focusing more on what can be achieved within those limitations. And what can mostly be achieved within those limitations is incredible wealth, the ability to become quite rich. And so that itself is an expansive vision, I suppose, but it's a more cynical one. So that's the big change. I think it's a change in mood. And so it's really after 89 that you really start to get great Chinese contemporary art as well. Because in the 80s, it's very derivative. It's very much reacting to this modernist kind of wave that we were talking about before. It's picking and choosing ideas that they see from Western books and Western exhibitions. Post-89, you get Chinese artists starting to reckon with what's happened in their history to date, what's happened in 89, and to what's going to happen in the future. And so at that point, you start to get really distinctive, extraordinary works of art being created in things like this, but some other things we'll have a look at in a minute too.
Yeah, and so there was 89, China closed down, but Deng Xiaoping declared it open for business in 1993. What about the exhibition in Hong Kong? Can you tell us a bit about the exhibition in Hong Kong that opened up that scene you've just described?
Yeah, what happened is that in the early 1990s, there were a couple of key curators, one a man called Johnson Chang, based in Hong Kong, another Li Shenting, based in Beijing, and they were keen to show some of this art where they saw kind of welling up in the kind of wake of Tiananmen Square. They wanted to bring it to the West, and so they created an exhibition, Chinese art post-89 it was called, and it actually toured the world. It opened in Hong Kong, and it actually came to Australia under a different name, Mao Goes Pop. I don't know whether any of you might have seen that exhibition. It was in Sydney. Basically the same exhibition. And what it was showing was the work of a group of young artists, all of whom had been students at the time of Tiananmen, and all of whom had kind of created work kind of coming out of the mood of that time. So these two curators, Johnson and Li Shenting, they decided that they would kind of try and categorise the kind of different movements of art they could see developing in this period. It was early 1990s. And the first was something they called political pop. And Wang Guangyi, who's the creator of this work, is the most famous exponent of that. And what you see here is a kind of mocking use of, traditional kind of socialist woodcut. But instead of your normal thing where your worker, peasant and soldier would be holding like an anvil, or not an anvil, a hammer, or some kind of, a sheaf of wheat or something that indicated their occupation. In this case, they're holding a pen writing Coca-Cola. So this is kind of, yes, the new China is about this. Our mission now is to create the consumer society. So that was one kind of movement, and there were other artists who also worked in that political pop kind of genre. So that's one. The next is what's often called cynical realism. They called it cynical realism. This is Feng Lijun. This image of the yawning youth actually appeared on the cover of Time magazine because people were so shocked by it. Because it's basically what he's trying to sum up is they're total. It's a bit like a kind of sequel to I Do Not Believe, except in this case we're just bored by it. We're bored by the whole idea of of China, the Communist Party, whatever. We're just going to go our own way, and it even is quite revolutionary in the sense that all of his youths are bald-headed, which normally suggests that they're criminals. To be shaven-headed normally means a criminal or a monk, but not so much. So this is what they're expressing, a kind of cynicism with where China is going, kind of boredom with it. But as you'll see, like over time, these cynical realists, they're not that cynical really. They're actually kind of romantics. They're romantics who've kind of failed to be romantic about life and become cynics, but they hold a kind of romantic spirit as well. And the third kind of movement that these two curators decided was a key movement in China in the sort of post-Tiananmen period was what they called the wounded romantic spirit. And the most famous exponent of that is Zhang Shaogang. And his work is probably still the most famous Chinese contemporary artwork. And I know that a lot of people, when they first saw these images, I certainly had this impression myself, that when you looked at this, you thought this really is something new. This is like, it's recognised to be Chinese, obviously. It's drawing on Western things. This is an oil painting. But there's something about it that really reflects Chinese society in a really deep way. No one can see these works, I don't believe, without feeling, really moved by what they convey. Zhang Xiaogang said that, they're based on old family photographs and photographs from the Cultural Revolution that he's recreated. But he says the point of the paintings is all these people are standardised, under the regime there's a sort of standardisation of Chinese people. But underneath that standardisation, these people are struggling to be individual. They're struggling to be free of that. But at the same time, they're bound by what are called bloodlines. See these little red lines that go between the people? They're connected to each other and they're connected to the past and they can't escape the past. So I think it's incredibly beautiful work, and it's certainly when this work and the previous work travelled abroad, it created, quite an impression. And of course, eventually, 10 years later, this is the work that becomes the most prized, in economic terms. Zhang Xiaogang still, I think, is the highest-selling artist in China. This work itself is the second most expensive work of Chinese art ever, contemporary art ever sold at auction. I forget the millions of dollars that were involved, but many millions of dollars. Yeah.
Australia played a role in this. Now, tell us about Australia's role in this. It's quite central.
It is. In the 1980s, there was developed a kind of very intimate relationship between Australia and China. This was down really to a few people, a handful of people. People like Sue are part of this story as well. There was a group of Australians who went to China in the 1980s and got very involved with trying to make cultural and personal connections in China. And at the time, there were also some important people like Jeremy Barmay, a name probably you'd know, important academic, Linda Javen, who was his wife at the time, Nicholas Jose, who was the cultural counsellor in the Australian Embassy. These people were all incredibly important in developing relationships between young Chinese cultural figures, artists who they thought were interesting, and Australian institutions. And so even before Tiananmen Square, Nick Jose particularly had involved himself in arranging some artists from China to come to Australia and spend time here, notably in Hobart and in other parts of Australia. And at the same time as that was happening, the Australian government had also decided that they would bring in this, the idea of Chinese students coming to study in Australia. They saw this as a great money-making scheme. People would come to Australia to learn English, and so this had started in the late 1980s. And so there are two reasons why Chinese contemporary artists have such a relationship with Australia. The first was these development of these links that had happened in the late 80s, which meant that a number of artists were known to Australia. And so post-Tiananmen, it could be arranged for them to come and live in Australia. They got visas, humanitarian visas to come to live in Australia post-Tiananmen Square because they were in trouble in China. The second reason is that a number of young artists came to Australia as students to study English and then stayed on after Tiananmen Square. Bob Hawkes, you probably recall, famously declared a kind of an amnesty. All the Chinese students in Australia at June 4 could stay in Australia. And so the result was that you get this incredible kind of offshore development of Chinese contemporary art in Australia, and there's a number of names associated with it, but one of them is Goergen, who we were talking about before. He's the one that I was telling you about that went to the army and so on. This is just fantastic work. People associate Goergen with that cynical realist kind of tendency, like the Yawning Youths. But his work really draws so much on his experience in the army, particularly that sort of sense that when you're in the army, you just have to kind of just keep smiling and carrying on, at all costs, And also that there was a lot of, there is a lot of, in the army in China, I think this is also something that in the Soviet Union is also quite notable too. There's a lot of singing and dance, song and dance troops, and a lot of this kind of thing where a beautiful girl will come in an army uniform and serenade the troops. And so kind of reproduces that here, but there's more in this too. Some Chinese people here might recognise this woman here. It's Song Zuying. She's a very famous Chinese singer. For many years was on the Spring Festival Gala every year. People used to say, why does she always get the gig? Why does that girl always get the gig? It was then revealed to us that she was, in fact, the mistress of Jiang Zemin, who was one of the General Secretary of the Communist Party in China in the 1990s. And so when he put her in the painting, that was very cheeky, and people kind of like immediately saw he was making a joke about that. The interesting thing about Song Zuying is she continues. She's not on the gala anymore, but she still tours. And recently she toured the artificial islands. You know that China's creating artificial islands in the South China Sea. She went to one of these islands and serenaded the brave pioneers who are now on these islands. So the work is, just keeps on having dimensions. And, it just keeps on giving this painting.
Oh, that's brilliant. Let's talk about the 798 district and the new century.
We won't have a chance to talk about this tonight, but this is a work by a young artist, Sal Fei, born in the year that Deng Xiaoping starts the open door policy, and she's really great representative of those artists who came of age during the new China. Wonderful woman and worth reading about. But anyway, this is a good one for 798. 798, if you guys don't know, is the kind of the most famous art district in China. And it was created by Huang Rui, the man we saw in the first slide. He and a group of friends discovered that there was this fantastic place, 798, which was full of these wonderful decommissioned factories. What happened was that the factories had been built in the 1950s to be used for military production. And they'd been built using East German architects. And so they've been built in the Bauhaus style. So they were built to be with soaring kind of ceilings and beautiful natural light, and built for people to work on like military equipment. But once they were deserted by the military at a certain point in the late 90s, they were just these beautiful open spaces. Huang Rui and some friends discovered they were empty and moved in and created the 798 district, 798 being the number of the factory, 798. And at first, the people who owned the factories, who was basically the Department of Defence, were very happy. They thought to themselves, well, we've got these empty factory buildings, no one's there, all the military stuff's moved out of Beijing production, and these scruffy artists, they're paying rent, that's great. They didn't expect them to turn it into this extraordinary kind of creative hub. But they did, and eventually it became so famous that when the army tried to evict them, because they thought these Bauhaus spaces would make wonderful condominiums and they could do very well out of them, they were unable to evict them because the 798 had become so famous by the mid-2000s when they tried to evict them that the Chinese government themselves decided that it was going to be a tourist attraction for the Olympics and they couldn't close it down. But at any rate, over those years, 798 still exists today. It's probably not quite today as edgy as it was when it first began, but it's still considered to be a place, it's kind of a safe zone where people can create art that you would not be able to exhibit in other parts of Beijing. You can exhibit there. This is an example of a work that by Huang Rui, who we saw in the first slide, which certainly could not be exhibited today in 798 and only managed to survive a couple of weeks when he exhibited it there in 2006, I think. Some of you can read, it says, long live Chairman Mao, Mao Zedong wan sui. And when you say long live about a person in Chinese, what you actually say is 10,000 years to that person. So wan sui is 10,000 years. What he noted was that Mao Zedong, the thing about Mao Zedong, the reason why most people think about Mao Zedong today is he's on every banknote. So every time you look in your pocket, there's Mao Zedong again. You may not think about his thought very often or follow his precepts, but you see his face every single day. So this work is actually a collage of 10,000 yuan. So it's 10,000 Chinese dollars made into the slogan, long live Mao Zedong, which is obviously, you can see why it's funny, you can see why it's subversive, and yes, this work cannot be shown in China now, and in fact, I don't think he can even export it. I think he tried to send one out of China not that long ago, and was told he wasn't allowed to even send it out.
Oh, really?
But yeah, it's terrific work.
Yeah.
And 798, definitely, for people who've not been there or have never been to Beijing, it's definitely still a great place to go, and you'll see some wonderful artwork there.
So just one last question. What do you think China has lost in this mix of power and money?
I think that, oh gosh, it's a very big question, and I think one thing that it's lost is a sense of, in a sense, what it's lost is a sense of common purpose. And I think when I looked at this slide and thought about having it as a number one slide today, I also thought it should really be the last slide as well, because it kind of shows what's been lost and what's been gained in a way. Because you look at it and you think, well, obviously all these people have gained the chance to not have bicycles and to have cars, and they've gained the opportunity to have, beautiful clothes too. They don't have to wear the Chinese uniform anymore. But by the same token, this demonstration could never happen in Beijing today. This would be impossible. If people tried to... This demonstration happened in the main streets of Beijing. 1,000 people joined it. Today, if you tried to exhibit such a banner in Beijing, you would certainly be immediately arrested. At this particular point, at the sort of start of the story in a way, when in 1978, 1979, when Deng Xiaoping decides to open China, tries to reform China post the Cultural Revolution, there's such a sense of openness. But there's also a sense of citizenship, that people believe in the idea of a citizen, that it's possible they'll be allowed to participate fully in their society. At this point, people believe that. When they're marching for the Constitution, they believe in that. It's just been rewritten. It says that they've got certain rights. They believe they'll be able to enforce them. And they believe that people will listen to them and that they'll be able to participate. And I think today there's less and less feeling that that is really possible. That being said, I will say that the thing that's to me most notable about all this period since 1978 to today is how persistent that idea is of participation, the desire to participate, the desire to make China a better place, the desire to speak truth to power. That continues. It's just that it's incredibly difficult, and the people who do it have to be quite brave, but it certainly persists. So I guess what's lost is a kind of idealism, I guess, a certain kind of morality. There's certainly a lot of corruption in China today. But at the same time, huge things have been gained. People are, richer and more secure. Life is more colourful. It's more free in many ways. But I think what's been lost here, maybe it's just that youthful idealism. I think that's been lost. And that's a sad thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, brilliant. I'd like to open the floor to a few questions. We actually only have a few minutes, but can I invite people to ask Madeleine some questions?
I've got the microphone.
Yeah, I can barely see, so I'll just get you to... Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I just wondered about the significance of the pig in that painting. Not that one.
Pink in which painting?
The pig. P-I-G, the pig, the animal.
The pig. Oh, God, the pig.
We thought you said pink.
The pig.
No.
Yeah, the pig. The pig is because when they're in the army, of course, they're on terrible rations, and they don't get to have like a pig very often. But occasionally, usually when they thought they were about to be sent off to die or something bad was about to happen, yes, a pig would appear. So it's really not a good thing when the pig arrives. I mean, yes, that's basically the pig is a kind of reward before you go off and do something dangerous or scary. Yeah.
There was another question here.
Hi. In this poster, which is a 79, I noticed a couple of women's faces just there in the second row on the left.
Yeah.
And then, by 89, when you had Tiananmen, can you maybe comment on what was the progress in terms of women's expression in this art movement? And I know that you've already shown a couple, like that contemporary piece with the zebra on the right was by a woman, and you've mentioned a few women artists, but I'm very interested in this sort of male-dominated, and I don't mean that in a put-down at all.
No.
I'm just really interested in the women's participation in this and how it progressed over that decade.
Yeah, it's very much the case that in the 80s that women artists are still very few and not getting a chance to really participate. It's very male-dominated in the 80s. That's definitely true. though, there's a kind of a revenge moment actually for women artists in 1989, which I kind of enjoy. In 1989, there was this huge and very important exhibition of Chinese contemporary art, No U-Turn exhibition, Chinese Avant-Garde, 1989. It was shown in the National Art Museum in China, the place that these guys hung their works outside of. In 1989, there was actually an exhibition of Chinese contemporary art in the museum. This is like early 1989, February 1989. One of the artists involved in that was a woman called Xiao Lu. She was just hadn't even graduated from art school at the time, and she had a work of hers included, which was an installation work. I won't go into great detail about what that was, but when on the first day the exhibition was on, she arrived to sort of, to see her piece in Pride of Place at the front of the exhibition. And she had decided that she wanted to complete the work. The work was about the impossibility of communication between men and women. She decided she wanted to complete the work, and so she had borrowed a gun, a loaded gun, and brought it with her to the exhibition. And she actually, she fired into it, point-blank range, a couple of shots, kind of semi-destroyed the work. This meant the whole exhibition was closed down. And so she kind of, in a way, although the women were not that much seen and didn't get much of an opportunity at that stage, she basically subverted the whole thing and got the exhibition closed down. So there were artists like her, and she continues to be quite a figure today. I think it was in the 90s the women artists really came to fore. And if I was writing a book about Chinese contemporary art, a survey, I would certainly have no trouble finding 50% women, because there are a lot of very important Chinese contemporary artists, but they tend to come, they're more from the 90s and today as well. In this sort of, in this period, there's a lot of interesting Chinese women artists.
Oh. Just one more question. Thanks.
I know this is not the subject of your book, and your talk's been fascinating, but has the period that you've spent and the conclusions that you've come to, such as the loss of collective versus individualism, the West has mentioned fleetingly through the discussion, has it caused you to reflect on our own situation here at home and in the West, and whether in fact we look at China but we don't see ourselves?
Yeah, that's a big question. Yes, I think that. Well, let me think. I think there's a real problem about us looking at China and not seeing China, actually. I think that it's such a big country. It's such an immense power now in our region that there's in the world that we look at it and we don't see China as China as a group of people. We see it as a monumental thing, and we see it very much in terms of the way it projects itself in the world. And I think that's a real problem. And there's an incredible need to connect with China on a personal level and on an emotional level. And that's where we have a great opportunity in Australia with our diaspora. Like, we have a very large Chinese population, which is a great benefit to Australia. But we also have the benefit of Chinese students coming to Australia. And I think one of the great tragedies of Australia right now is that, I certainly see this in Sydney where I live just near the universities. I live near Chinatown. I notice that Chinese students, so much they come here to study, and they don't get a lot of opportunity to mix with Australians. They end up being there much together because they're such a large group. They end up hanging out together. And I think that if there was one thing I would challenge all of us to do, and the universities in particular to do, we need to work much harder on developing relationships. And those kind of relationships can be incredibly important. Sue and I both know from our experience living in China in the 80s the kind of fantastic relationships you can develop. Things that are very important, like Australian contemporary art today, benefits so much from the relationships that were formed in the 1980s between China and Australia. Today we have that opportunity too to make incredible connections and build relationships and have an emotional connection to China. We need to take that opportunity because Australia is in such a special position to do that. So I guess that's what I think. We look at China, we should try and see China, but try and see it in the opportunities we have every day to connect with Chinese people.
Look, this has been a fabulous talk. I've just so enjoyed listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And a small token of our appreciation. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for coming. Thank you. Yeah.